Greetings, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of the Halversen and McKinlay video podcast series. We are excited to have you with us today. Scott, it's great to see you in New York.
Clint, always great to be here. Thanks for coming back for episode 3.
Yes, I decided I would come back for episode 3. And thank you for doing the same. We've had a lot of fun doing these video podcasts, everyone. We're figuring out how to do it. This isn't something that we were born with knowledge of how to do. And so we are learning as we go. We appreciate all of your follows of on our YouTube channel, comments and shares. It's our way of paying it forward, right? When we see content that we like, and it's what Scott and I do when we see content that we like. So we appreciate you allowing us to pay that message forward. Today, the title of episode 3, we ready, Scott? Drum roll. We have lessons from the C-suite that anyone can apply in any role. So, yes, we're talking about that place called the C-suite, which is one of the most discussed and coveted places in your company, right? It's the place where power is wielded. It's where the biggest decisions are made. It's where fates are decided, ultimately, many times. The place where key strategies and organizational priorities are debated and anointed. It's the desired destination for ambitious types in companies, even as the people who come in and out of it often appear dazed, overly stressed, and exhausted. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, what goes on in that C-suite. The path to get there looks different for everyone, although Scott and mine are similar. A good C-suite is full of people that are at the top of their game in their respective areas, but they share some common traits. Most importantly, alignment to the CEO and willingness to compromise. In fact, the CEO is rarely the smartest person in the room in the C-suite, and in my opinion, shouldn't be. But the CEO should be the one that is truly exceptional at attracting the right talent, asking the right questions, and listening, and then being able to synthesize data for its meanings and make decisions. But everybody has a role to play in that C-suite. So what are the number one lessons, as Frank Sinatra would croon, about this place? And how are they applicable through an organization, regardless of title or pay grade? We will cover these lessons today, so buckle up and get ready. The lessons today are broadly applicable. And again, they can be applied in any role, as it opens up your field of vision to your organization and what might be going on in some of the halls of power. So let's get into it. Lessons from the C-suite. Lesson number 1 will be being nice versus being kind. Lesson number 2 will be managing up and down an organization. Managing up is something that we get asked about a lot. And lesson 3, how to know what matters most at any given time. So Scott, excited to dive in with you today for our episode 3. As we talk about being nice versus being kind, Scott, as lesson 1 from the C-suite, I'm reminded of some stand-up comedy I recently heard that said people from the West Coast, like LA where I live, and are nice but not kind. And people on the East Coast, like New York where you live, are kind but not nice. Let me just say, despite the humor there, and perhaps some of it warranted, I think we can be nice and kind. I think you're capable of being nice. I think I'm capable of being kind. This isn't about zip codes, but there are attitudes sometimes that are pervasive, and we'll start by talking about the difference. Nice is superficial and soft. Nice says, "Oh, I'm sorry that happened to you," or sending good vibes. Kind, on the other hand, is practical and helpful to the growth of another, but it isn't always very soft. For example, a kind statement might sound like this: "Let me tell you what you are doing wrong so you can grow." Or how about this one? "I am annoyed that you need help changing your flat tire, but I will teach you how to do it now so you can get back on the road ASAP and learn for the next time." So in short, honesty is kind. And in the long run, it always pays a dividend. Scott, those are some of my opening salvos on being nice versus being kind. What do you have to add?
Well, honesty is kind for sure, but it isn't always nice. Transparency is kind, but it often isn't nice and often doesn't leave people feeling very good. In the New York area, you could find a traffic accident any day, but people are willing to help out. People understand it's hard. So even though they're cursing you out, they're going to help you. Having lived in California myself, they're like, oh, bro, too bad, man. You got a flat tire. That's too bad. I gotta go. So like, have a good day. And you just sit there. You're like, oh my goodness, like that. It's a stereotype. It's not always the case, but I think that people have the ability to be nice, have the ability to be kind. In the workplace, it's a little bit different, and I think there are ways in which niceness manages a moment, where kindness manages the true relationship, where niceness is concerned with emotions for the now, kindness is concerned with that true help to assist somebody to grow, has a longer outlook. I experienced this a few years ago. I reported directly to the president of a company, and I thought, like, we were doing really well. We had our plans, we're executing on it. And I get called in to the president's office one day, and he kind of just had this look, like this serious look. And he's like, sit down for a minute. I'm like, okay. And, I'm like a puppy dog. I'm like, okay, what do you got now? Like, what are we going to do? And he's like, I need you to be better. And I'm like, whoa, hit me like a ton of bricks. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, I need you to manage these relationships internally and with, some of our external partners in such a way that we're going to accomplish these goals in Q3. He says, right now, it seems very reactive, and I need you to step up and take that seriously. So be conscious about it every day. And I was like, wow, I didn't even realize that. He goes, from the moment you walk into the office, people are checking out your temperature. They're looking to see how you're going to react that day, and their day depends on yours. He goes, I need you to be on your game every day. And I was like, wow, that to me was kindness. It hurt because I felt like I was really doing a good job, but I so appreciated that. And that relationship has not ended. In fact, I saw him this past weekend in New York, and it was like one of those things where we took the time out to have dinner. He's doing things, I'm doing things. We made it happen. So the relationship stayed intact, even though those words were piercing. He was looking at my growth. I had another great teacher. His name was Simon Hemus. He's now retired. He's the COO of Tupperware brands back in the day when they were rocking. And it was my first entree into direct selling. And the first big event was a national conference, and they're getting to announce me for the region that I'm going to have. And we're sitting back in kind of like the employee area, green room type. And he just looks at me, he goes, they going to put you on stage in a minute? And I'm like, yeah. In a few minutes, he goes, you're not wearing that suit, are you? I'm like, what are you talking about? I had just bought this suit like 2 weeks prior to. I was so proud of it. I was feeling good. And he goes, we are not in the insurance sales business. We are in the beauty business. We are in the entertainment and education business. He goes, I need you to look the part. And it was one of those things where I was like, are you serious? And he's like, yeah, this is how it's done. He goes, do you have anything else? And so I had to beeline it to my room to get something that was more along the lines of how he dressed. And it was just one of those teaching moments. And man, it hurt. It hurt. But it transformed the way I thought about every touch point. You're on stage, every time you're in front of people, you are conveying the brand, and that's what matters. So I appreciated those kind moments, even though they were like piercing.
Well, what about when the answer is no, Scott? What about when you're in a position of authority and you've got to tell somebody no? That's almost impossible to do. That's almost impossible to do nicely. How do you do it kindly?
So guidelines, rules always are your friend. If you have processes in place and you have like something that you can rely on, saying no, in my opinion, can be done with kindness. Some of the like part of my life is done in a volunteer basis, and it usually takes about 20 hours during the week at most. And oftentimes I may be in one-on-one sessions with people, and they're looking for the rules to bend their way to make things happen. And I have to just listen. I have to be empathetic. And I really am, because I want the best outcome for them. But oftentimes I have to say, well, here are the guidelines, here are the rules that we follow, here are the certain laws that we follow, and there's no deviating from that. So even though the world is going one direction, from a, let's say, from a spiritual sense, it's staying constant. So people have to make that work. And I think the interesting thing is they appreciate the directness, but done with kindness. And they know, okay, now I know the boundaries. Then they can act, and they choose to act accordingly. The same thing within an organization. If they know their roles, that's where that happens. In fact, it just reminded me of this really cool experience I had. My daughter is a film student, and we were at a set one night, and we were watching what was happening, and we were on this like campus parking lot, and they're getting ready to shoot, and then all of a sudden campus police come, and they're just making a big deal about it. And I have like, I'm like, oh, these guys are just going to cause problems. And the director didn't step in. My daughter, who was the assistant director, didn't step in. The person who had the job to deal with them dealt with it. And I was talking to my daughter during that. I'm like, you want me to go over there and like talk to those guys? And she's like, don't you dare. Everyone here knows what their role is, and they're going to do it. So the leader didn't overstep the boundaries, had established those guidelines, and people knew how to act accordingly. And then they found a solution. So it's like an organization is just the same as a movie set. It works the same. Know your role, know who's leading, know the guidelines, and people will step up and act accordingly.
Yeah, in fact, it's unkind to ask something of a leader that is outside of the policies, which is something we don't normally think about. Just to validate that a bit on the honesty being kind, I remember getting ready for a board meeting one time, and my CEO advisor, Mauro Schneidman, looked at my SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and he kind of read me the riot act and said it was weak, which, trust me, didn't feel good. Because of course I wanted him to be proud of me too, but more than that, I needed to learn from him. So I took it as a moment to say, okay, and come back to him with something with more teeth. And he said, Clint, if you're not honest about weaknesses and threats, even about your strengths and opportunities, how would you feel if you were in the board and you were surprised by something that hadn't been disclosed? Surprises are not kind. So I learned from that. I learned to be a little bit more open and direct about risks and threats, because the more information that you are exposed to, the more you need to share. Every boss has a boss, right? And people don't like to be surprised. Honesty is indeed kind. The last few things I'll say here is nice is like corporate manners, please and thank you. It's not being a jerk to someone's face. I think it's important to be nice, but what's more important in a business setting is kindness, which I believe is true benevolence. Niceness might be the frosting, but kindness is the cake. That means give the honest stuff, give the real information, and trust in everybody's ability to deal with honesty. And then you're in a kind organization. So Scott, let's move on to lesson number 2. Interesting to talk about niceness and kindness. And I would love your feedback on this topic, everybody. Lesson number 2 is managing up and down an organization. So Scott, what are your opening salvos here on managing up and down, knowing that people are listening, the lion's share of whom probably need to manage up? Why don't we start there with managing up and give us some of your thoughts?
It's one of those things where, when I've been in leadership roles, it's always like, I want to be kind to people, and I have a positive energy. I have a positive outlook. It's very optimistic. But at the same time, I kind of have this look too. And I remember when during the pandemic, I showed up at this new role, and we're wearing masks in the office, and only people could see like barely my eyebrows and my eyes, and zero expression on my face. And for the first week, like nobody said a word. It was like, whoa, like who is this guy? And I realized I had to show niceness and kindness in order to get them to buy into this new guy coming in, because they were already like moving in a direction. And it's one of those things where I had to be very aware that every interaction, every manifestation that I showed was like a negotiation that was happening. And that day could be won or lost based on how I interacted with people. And I thought that was really important. And it took effort. So even like on a bigger scale, when you look at CEOs that have to report to shareholders, yeah, stocks go up and down, sales trends never stay the same. The only thing we know is change is always constant. And so you have to manage how people are reacting in the moment, and people's patience today are even less. So, you win some, you lose some, but how you deal with that and you prepare for the ups and downs, how you greet it with maturity is really going to determine, are you the winner of the day? And it's not about winners and losers, because you want everyone to win, but you as a leader, you are creating that scenario, whether people are going to rise to the occasion or revolt. And I think that's important. It reminds me of this Rudyard Kipling poem called If. And I think C-suite members should really like have this somewhere to read and look. And I'm just going to take a couple of stanzas for it. It may spark some interest. It may spark some reflection. But you can relate to this because you've been there. And it starts off, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait, not be tired by waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give away to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make your thoughts your aim, if you can treat the triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters the same. Love that. That's like my favorite. And lastly, he ends it with, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, being relatable to everyone. If neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. I love that, because it basically is just saying, cooler heads prevail. You control the destiny of that organization, and people will respond accordingly. My favorite is, if you can meet triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters the same, because people will realize that, yes, you realize that the C-suite adventures are like a roller coaster. You're going to always have ups and downs in negotiations. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some, but you never deviate from the focus. And that to me is really what counts in the C-suite. Every negotiation you enter in, whether it's like company ownership, vendors, talent, hiring people, firing people, creating different departments, splitting departments, maybe even with your family or relationships of dear ones that are closest to you. I believe that we would all be better in those scenarios when we read and ponder this poem as part of that preparation, so that we can act accordingly and not overreact to where we're spending most of our time cleaning up our own messes. So it reminds me of every interaction I would have with the CFO would be a negotiation. I'd
for sure.
Yeah, I'd prepare for it. I'd come down the hallway. I'd have my data ready, the analysis. I'd have the predicted ROI, what the overall results of a program would be, what it was going to cost, and what the resources were needed. And I was scared to death, because I just was like, these guys are the most intimidating in the world. What I come to find out is, because I went so prepared, like we would talk later on down the road, and they're like, man, every time I saw you, Scott, coming down the hallway, I knew I was going to be in for it, because I didn't want to say yes. And so think about that. I'm going down there nervous because I'm knowing he wants finding all the reasons to say no, and I need him to say yes. And he's like, I don't want to say yes. I want to say no. And so the negotiation began before we even talked. The best part in most of those situations is that we aligned on the common goals of the business, and was it right, and was it right for the stakeholders in place. If those aligned, we felt good about it, we shook hands, and we said, let's go get it done. If there were holes that either of us like put in that plan, we were okay by saying, let's come back to it, or let's not do it. And so everything was like this awesome negotiation, but I prepared the most for those. Same with reporting to CEOs. I mean,
Well, I would
how many
say,
times have you done that?
well, think about the CFO for a second. I mean, you were just talking about going down the hall to meet with the CFO and having your story straight. And CFOs and companies are very important. Uh, Cash is king, as we say, and cash is also oxygen for the organism. And so the person that you have managing cash in a company is a very high trust position. And there's no shortage of executives who will come his or her way within the confines of budgets, and which are kind of living things, but thinking you have money to spend. And many times it can feel like a dead end because CFOs are indeed, as they should be, empowered from time to time to say no. They say no as much as anyone in the building. But going there and learning how to negotiate, Scott, with that particular member of that team in that company, what a lesson for you to learn. And I think as sales oriented individuals, we're a little bit more excitable. And you look at the CFO who's less excitable and has their foot on the brake a little more. Or put it this way, they have a foot on all the pedals as it relates to cash. And so that is quite the relationship, right? And having a kind negotiating strategy, knowing this person could be in the C-suite with you, you may have a similar amount of power in the company, but what they control is critical. Or you might be subservient to them in the organizational chart, but needing to get something approved. So what you talked about, having all your material ready and them knowing they were in for it, when Scott was walking down the hall, that's good culture. That means we're going to have a debate right now. It's going to go down with Scott. And you mentioned at the end that aligning on what was best for the business, if you could both get there, always the best case scenario. And that's, I think, the North Star is how can I align with this other person who might be someone I'm managing up to, right? It's aligning to what's best for the business and coming prepared and in being kind. That's a good formula for facing the CFO.
Let me ask you a question, Clint. When you were CEO at Ruby Ribbon, how much, like, what was the percentage of time that you prepared in managing up to the board of directors on a weekly basis?
I'll tell you, my first year, I wrote them a letter once a week. I was a new CEO. I was a little bit overwhelmed, and I knew I needed to over communicate. So for my first year in the job, I wrote them a tome every Friday, like pages and pages. In fact, if I took every email, the 52 emails that I wrote to the board of directors in my first year, I could make a book called My First Year. And it probably a little bit too many embarrassing things to put into a book. But
Yeah.
ultimately, they knew what was going on, not just in the company, because I always had a financial deck attached to it, but it was more about my mind. What was I thinking about? What did I think mattered, and what was I worried about? And what threats did I think mattered, and where did I think we were going to prevail? Now, year two, I did those monthly. I said no more weekly emails. I think I can take the training wheels off. But preparing for them all the time, Scott, really to get to your question, whether it was a weekly email, whether it was a monthly meeting or a quarterly board meeting where we really got into the financials and the operating results, constant preparation. Because I was subservient to them. I worked at their pleasure. They hired me. And even though they gave me the keys to the company, I reported to them and I had to manage up. And I think over communication, preparing well, sharing not just numbers, but what you're thinking. And some great questions you can ask, which I learned through those emails, was what else would you be thinking about if you were me about this situation? It's irresistible for them. They're going to respond. And if you're managing up and you think you have something more or less solved, One really good way to see if you're aligned with your leader is to ask, if you were me, what else would you be thinking about? It's soft, it's easy to ask that. It's not a rude question to ask somebody else. And man, we got some gold out of that. So that's granted, the frequency of it dissipated as the years went on, but certainly the regularity of it was known by me and known by the board, so that they were always apprised, and I could manage up in this way.
Yeah, I think those are critical touch points. And even in a role as president, the owner of the parent company, anytime I could get face to face, talk about what we're doing, this is what we did, here's what we accomplished, this is where we're going, that was valuable time for me because that was my barometer. And I knew exactly how their attitude towards that investment was going to go, and I really valued that time. If it ever got canceled, I was so bummed. I was like, we need to meet tomorrow, like we need to make that up, and I didn't want like a week to go by. So managing up is as critical as executing any project, in my opinion. So that's
Yeah,
just the way
true.
I see it.
Well, I agree with that, and we talk about negotiation as a key part of managing up. And how can you know where your negotiating no-fly zones are? How can we know what's off the table at any given time? And, as I think about this in C-suites, it seems many decisions that C-suite types are making are predicated on their own values. So this includes the action that the member of the C-suite will personally take. It also informs how they will insert themselves into their organizations and how they will lead out. If you don't know yourself well enough and what you value, it's going to be very difficult. The challenges and noise will eat you alive. So, for tips on how to get harmony with what your values really are and live according to them, I recommend the book Life Manual by celebrated Canadian entrepreneur and a former mentor of mine, Peter H. Thomas. Peter, you're a beautiful human if you're listening. Thank you for all you've taught me. Peter teaches in his book that a process of self-reflection, journaling, and honesty with ourselves can help us form a list of non-negotiables in life, the things that we hold as most valuable. If you ask somebody what they value, Scott, what I am used to hearing from most people is things like freedom, family, faith, honesty, big words that frankly are nebulous. What does it mean that you value your family? Does it mean that you want to spend physical time with them? Does it just mean that you love them? How does that inform your decision making? Using general platitudes here is not particularly helpful in saying, like, I believe in integrity and faith and family. Well, welcome to every other human being who will probably say the same thing. I think it's helpful to get much more specific. Once you have your list of values, there's another layer of work, Scott, which is matching our behavior to those values. If we truly value these things, then we will feel centered in when we behave in accordance with them. When we don't, we feel dissonance. And so heading into a negotiation, this is critical to know. It's critical to know what you believe and what you can stand behind. And if you have to create some little no-fly zones, that's fine. But once you have that template in mind, remember that most things are in fact negotiable. We're not talking about giving your firstborn. We're not talking about, I would hope, anything illegal. It comes into what's malleable and what can we play with. So negotiating is such an important aspect of leadership, Scott, especially as we manage up. What other insights can you offer up for managing up specifically?
The only thing I would add to all of the really great insight that you provided is, when you're managing up, also ask really good questions of those to whom you're reporting, and ask them to engage in dialogue and force them to respond with some clarity in such a way that they want to add to. I would always call it like, oh, they just add like a plus to every conversation. And that's where their experience comes into play. And you can ask them to connect the dots. You can ask them to explain their reasoning. It's like, I've got you through points A through S. Help me get to Z. And what are you thinking about that helps that? Because I'm not seeing it. And there's nothing wrong with being vulnerable in that position, but they just shore up any holes that may be in there, and you could find some answers in that. I also like using some questions such as like aligning priorities and saying, how does focusing on this priority affects some of the other priorities that we've talked about already? Because sometimes, you can only do something with time, resources, and money, and you never have an infinite reserve of all. So it's like, where do you prioritize some things? And then, well, what are we willing to de-emphasize to make something like this project happen? And then you get into some really great dialogue with those that you're reporting up to and managing up, so that you all come to the same conclusion. And then you go execute.
Well, that's really, really insightful. I'd like to repeat those last two questions, Scott, in case anybody missed them. These two questions are gold when you are managing up. Number one, how does focusing on this priority affect other priorities? The second one, you said, what are we willing to de-emphasize? Okay, these are good ones.
Is that not a negotiation or what? Like, that is a negotiation at its best.
If you listen to nothing else in this podcast, take those two questions home. I'm going to give you a third one that I think will be really helpful. Speaking of questions when you're managing up, I love this one, and it came from Procter & Gamble. I reported to some people out of the P&G leadership pipeline at another company. Their names were Dan Rajak and Jen Steves-Kiss, both Canadian American and strong leaders that came out of Procter & Gamble. They taught me a great opener. What would have to be true? Examples. What would have to be true for the sales forecast to be accurate? What would have to be true to increase the productivity of the sales force? What would have to be true to consider this alternate proposal?
Dude, those questions are lit. Like, that is
They're
amazing.
ridiculous. I mean, thank you, Procter & Gamble. I mean, the what would have to be true questions always engender rich dialogue and deeper understanding with your leaders. How could they not? I have had success managing up with this approach. Granted, I was led by Jen Steves-Kiss to the water to drink so that I would know how to ask the question. But then I wound up asking the question of her many times, and she would give me a little bit of a smirk and a wink maybe, and then go into what would have to be true. Because what happens is, once the leader says what would have to be true, once that question gets answered, you're going to be exposed to their assumptions. Bingo. The following things: assumption, 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 assumption. You just got a lot of assumptions, and those are up for clarification, and those can be discussed. That's how you get there with the person that you that you're managed by. Ask the right questions with this curiosity, get to priorities and what would have to be true. And I think we are going to be managing up with great aplomb, Scott. So we've been through niceness versus kindness in business. We've been through managing up and down and across. We've been to managing up, but we haven't gotten to down and across. So let's get to managing down and across a bit, Scott. Give us some insights here from your experience.
I will just say this at the start. Managing up is the challenge. It's fun. It's invigorating for me. Managing down is an exercise in discipline. It's an exercise in patience, and especially when you're not on the same speed and you're not, the vision isn't as clear. So the way that I've found easiest to manage down or across an organization comes down to 4 words: iterate, test, learn, and then repeat. So for those of you who have to manage hair on a daily basis, just think of it as simple as lather, rinse, and repeat. And it's one of those where if you have a high performing organization, you've got a lot of people you have to manage, there are many projects going on, it's imperative on each project that you're like, okay, how are we going to get there? Let's test this out a little bit. What did we learn from the test? How do we make it better? How do we improve? And then you go through that process until you're confident that you can roll it out and it's not going to be a problem. And that's like maybe 80%, I would say, accuracy. And like, yes, if we do this, we're going to achieve this result. So I really like that process. And it's never about, just rushing through. It's about, are you learning to get better at every stage of the process? And are you going to have the discipline instilled within the team to say, oh yeah, let's just try it out one more time to get it right? Because that will save you a lot of headaches down the road. And I think you develop this sense of trust, respect among the team. Everyone's involved, everyone has a voice. And now you've got a true meritocracy that's going to happen through that organization. I run into this all the time, and it has to do with dealing with younger generations, how they receive, they're very sure about themselves, they know what's going on, and so you have to lean into that. But at the same time, you have to teach. And so it takes a lot of discipline. I remember uh, going into a completely different culture, and I we had this project that would really help increase revenue, but it was about taking a different approach to behaviors, growing competency and growing confidence with those who are out promoting the products and the business. And I knew going into it that it was going to be like all kinds of pushback, only because of the area in the world that I was going. It's always like, yeah, that's great for you guys in the US and your approach, but over here, that's not how we do things. Because there
Wait,
was
so cross
always,
culturally, you're going in cross culturally, telling them how to change their behavior in a sales process. Thorny, huh?
ex-
Yeah, of
oh, and you just knew that was going to be like met with resistance. And it was met with resistance when
course.
I was
Yeah.
in the US, like telling people, like, oh, I don't think they're going to go for it. I'm like, I'll tell you what, hear me out. Let me explain the principles. Let me explain the activities. And here are the results that are going to happen from it. And so everyone's like, nah, that can't happen here. We would do a little test with the group that I was presenting to, who'd be in charge of executing it. Sure enough, the results came in as predicted. It was hilarious. And I've done it so many times that I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I would just predict it. And it's like, wow, how would you know? It's like, because I've done it over and over and over again. And then it was like, okay, now we got to take it to the next level. And let me tell you, fear and trepidation were all part of it. It's getting out of your comfort zone. But the results ended up being the same. And then all of a sudden, trust begins to build. And it's one of those where it was like, go step by step, iterate the process, test it out, talk about the things that you've learned, and then go repeat the process
And then
until
and
you
then
get it
repeat it.
right. Yeah.
So this was a sales process, right? You were working with the sales force in Europe,
Yeah.
changing their approach, right? Which you run into cultural crosswinds pretty quickly. But you're basically talking about language they use in approaching, how to follow up, how to ask the right questions to a prospect, and it challenged them to get out of their comfort zones. And what you're telling me is when they actually left the room and did the practicing, you were able to corroborate that their close rates, that their follow-up conversation rates, that all the things that one would measure from a metric standpoint in the sales process were about where you predicted of people who had done it the same way in the US. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's not about the US being better. It's just about human beings being similar. I have a very similar story, Scott, to this involving a similar sales training in Southeast Asia when I was in Jakarta, Indonesia. Again, talking about the sales process with a sales force there, talking about the questions we ask to stimulate interest, talking about invitation language, follow-up language, this sort of thing. It's like the blocking and tackling of day-to-day reach outs and filling your sales funnel. And so we had some new elements in that process for them to think about. And again, we're in Indonesia at this point. I'm standing up there as an American. The room is 95% female. 100% are wearing the hijab, practicing Muslims. And I had this epiphany in working with one of our leaders there, who I enjoyed the heck out of her. Yeah, her name was Fitri. And what I learned from Fitri, who wore the coolest little pins holding up her hijab to her blouse, that she wanted the same things for her family that I wanted for mine. That really we were part of one race called the human race. And we had similar passions, desires, and goals for our family. And I said, Fitri, give this a shot. We're the same, me and you. Everybody wants to say we're different, but we're really the same. And she smiled big. I'll never forget the smile. And she went back to the team she was working with, and we went through, Scott, and had very similar results to what you found in Europe. And it's just so interesting that cross culturally, when we engage in this manner, when we talk about iterating, testing and learning, and we sort of take away the spooky nature of it. We take away anything cultural that might be weird. We just say we're iterating, we're testing, we're learning, and we're repeating. It takes away the fear of failure a little bit, right? Because they know that learn and repeat are part of the process, not things you'll be scolded for or disciplined for. So there is safety in this process, and I just wanted to validate that.
Oh, that's a great story. And I would say most of my most satisfying interactions I've had are with people from other countries, other cultures. And to your point, at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. And that's where you find that commonality. That's where you build the trust. And that's where the process helps get those two cultures on the
Yeah.
same page for growing. So that's fantastic. All right, let's go to our last lesson. And that's really, I think this is the key to the C-suite. It's how to know what matters most at any time. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Scott, if I asked you what time it is right now, how long would it take you to respond accurately?
Millisecond.
Okay, how about the weather? Like, what's it going to do in New York this week? How long would it take you to tell me?
Less than a second.
Yeah, you've got tools. You have a dashboard on your phone, I imagine, right? Because you actually have a phone. In 2023,
Yeah.
leaders need to know what matters right now as readily as Scott knew the time and the weather for New York. I like to think about it as this arc. Any initiative or big program in a company will follow an arc where they're in alignment with the following: values come first, then objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? Strategy, which is the central idea of how to accommodate it or make it work. Tactics is part of that, and then execution, and then results. At any moment in time, you got to have your smartphone out to answer questions about what matters most. Where are we on this continuum is really what that is asking. Because if you're just at the beginning, you can say, what's important right now is to align on objectives for this. Or what's most important right now is that the strategy be finished. What's most important right now is that the tactics are fleshed out. What's important right now is that we execute with excellence. What's important right now is we study the results and learn. So depending on where we are on that continuum, knowing where you are means you're an aware leader. You know what's going on right now in your company or in your department, and you can zero in on this awareness to give you a sense of what matters most because you know where you are in this process. Via this calculus, a leader should be able to declare freshly current priorities and decisions to be made based on other factors. This is why it's hard to turn your brain off as a leader. And as much as I am in favor of rest and relaxation and time off, I'm also a big fan of regular dialogue and monitoring with all stakeholders in these decisions. An aloof leader will struggle immensely. The weekly one-on-ones are so important with the people that you manage. You have an obligation to help them become the best professionals that they can be. And how you know what matters most for your company is in that regular dialogue you have, because you understand what your leaders are saying in the C-suite, but you also have to know what the boots on the ground are saying. What is reality squaring with what was perceived to be reality in the C-suite? Super important. Staying connected in this way will help you know in your leadership responsibility, whether you're leading a team of entrepreneurs or employees or a company, what matters most right now. Staying clued in. So I would say a goal for any one-on-one. First of all, let's talk about one-on-ones just quickly. Be doing them. Be doing them regularly. For most people in a reporting relationship, I would do it weekly. They don't have to be long. Maybe they can be 15 minutes one week, a half an hour, or an hour the next, but we need to check in and knowing at the end and agreeing and aligning at the end of any one-on-one with what matters most right now. If you can just do that at the end of every one-on-one, it will save you a lot of misunderstanding and potential trouble. So knowing where you are, being aware of where you are on the arc of an initiative, and checking in with your people that you work with on a weekly basis, and saying back to each other verbally what the most important thing is right now. Scott, this goes a long way to keeping us on track.
Yeah, one-on-ones are very powerful. There's no doubt. As you were talking about the arc, it reminded me of a story, well, an experience, I'll say, that I had when we both worked at Rodan and Fields. And, we all want to make a mark for ourselves. And my experience could really like help in a certain demographic. And I remember presenting this to the CEO at the time. And this is, I'm coming from a good place. I see an opportunity and I'm like, we need to have a strategy to market to a particular demographic. And I was so excited about it. I spent like a whole week putting this presentation together. And this like ties this whole thing together. I was met with kindness, but I was met with sharpness and clarity at the same time. It's like, I hear what you're saying. However, that's not the objective we have right now, Scott. We, our brand right now has a certain particular image that we are looking to connect with demographics that we've already identified that we know will help us get to our ultimate objective. And, she didn't have to lay it all out, but she says, our central strategy is to really get to the next level and disrupt the industry with the two demographics that we've identified. While you may have a case, it doesn't fit with that. So she told me no. And it was like, but we could be so much bigger. And she's like,
yeah, but nothing about that was offensive. It just seems like the word you said was sharpness. And so I think about sharpness on a monitor or on a projector is about getting the image crisp. It's not about stabbing you with a knife. It's about getting crisp. And it sounds like she was.
Yeah, it was the clarity. And then I will tell you that was a great lesson that I learned, because as soon as that was like crystal clear in my mind, we just went over the tactics of how are we going to meet those objectives, executed every month on excellence, and got the results. And so like did I feel like, was I a failure? No, it was the leader had a greater objective, and it was based on the values of the company, and she knew crystal clear what needed to be executed upon. So I think you're right in that arc 100%. Values, objectives, strategy, tactics, execution, the results will be there.
Yeah, and that's similar to iterate, test, learn, repeat. It's another way of saying it. The iterate, test, learn, repeat is really appropriate for managing down situations, so you don't complicate things all that much. But being aware as a leader and knowing where you are on the other arc is key. So just to summarize, everybody, we've talked about lessons from the C-suite today. This has been a great exchange, Scott. Being nice versus being kind, managing up and down an organization, and we included a little section on negotiation there, and how to know what matters most at any time in leadership. Wow, we loved bringing this content to you. We are grateful to the clients that we work with in our consulting practice. And one of the things that we do in our consulting practice is we work with dollars and cents, right? We create growth, which means revenue growth. We work with leaders to do this, and it's a serious endeavor. But what undergirds what we do is the way that we think, the way that we are with people. This matters a great deal to me and Scott, and we want to make sure in our podcast that we're able to share this with you. And we also think that these tips are universally applicable across any role. So thank you for allowing us to share it. This is why we do it and why we're passionate about it. And we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. In the meantime, subscribe, like, comment, all the things. Any last words, Scott?
No, thanks for everyone for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it, and be excellent every day as a human being. We'll see you on the next episode.
See you, everybody.